Welcome to the START podcast, Somatic Tools for Alignment, Regulation, and Transformation. I'm your host, Jessa Hooley. This episode is recorded as part of START, a free somatic healing program for people with painful childhoods. Join START to get access to this podcast along with exclusive monthly on-demand classes led by me, a somatic trauma specialist. If you're ready to create a life of calm, confidence, and belonging, join START by visiting alwaysvibin.com or search Vibin Wellness in your Apple or Google Play App Store. That's alwaysvibin.com. Hey, and welcome back. My name's Jessa. I'm a somatic trauma specialist, and I'm so happy that you're here today. It is the second episode in February. If you're new, we follow a different theme every month. This month's theme is using pleasure as medicine. If you haven't listened to episode 1 for this month, I highly recommend you going back and starting there. That's going to set up the foundation for why I'm even talking about what I'm talking about, how pleasure impacts your nervous system, and then you'll be really set up to head into today's episode with more context. Today, we're going to be talking about why you may have difficulty accessing pleasure, or why you might not even want to try to access pleasure. These are all very valid experiences. But before we get into that, I would like to invite you to just pause and take a breath. Beautiful. Now, this podcast is built for people with childhood trauma, which means that we will be touching on topics, discussing things that may bring to the surface some of your traumatic imprints. If anything comes up, any sensation shows up in your body that feels overwhelming or just something you don't want to interact with right now, I invite you to just pause the episode, take a break, look around, get yourself some water, just interact with things that feel good, and then come back when you're ready. We'll learn best when we're feeling safe to do so. Heading into today's episode, I'd like to begin with a little embodied practice. So if you're able to, just pause where you are. And you're welcome to close your eyes if you want to. It's not necessary, but I want you to feel into your body. We're not going too deep. Just get a general sense of what you can sense in your body right now, how it feels. And then I'm going to say something, and I want you to track what sensations show up after I say it. I think you should pleasure yourself more. What shows up when I say that for you? I think you should pleasure yourself. Just noticing any sensations, any thoughts, visualizations, any channel of your experience that pops up when I say, I think you should pleasure yourself more. And letting go of the practice, taking a breath, maybe finding some movement, coming back into your space. And let's just reflect a little bit on what happened for you. Now, a myriad of things might have shown up when I said that for you. Some of you may have accessed some very strong survival energy when I said that. And as I go through these responses, we're going to get into the reasons in just a little bit. When I said that, some of you might have felt angry or disgusted or really, really uncomfortable and anxious. That's the survive. This is a threat when I said that it was registered as a threat in your body. And there was mobilizing energy that made you want to make it stop. Maybe some of the visuals were really erotic or very confusing. It might have made you feel really unsettled in some ways. Maybe it made you feel really excited. and giddy. Maybe it brought up some humor in you. Maybe it brought in a sense of calm. Depending on the beautiful breadth and nuance and intricacies of your life, the word pleasure comes with a whole world of baggage with it. It's really become a stigmatized word in our culture outside of conscious circles. And so today we're going to talk about why this particular exercise, this particular practice, the practice of pleasure, might be challenging for you. And the reason why we want to understand that is so that you can enter into this practice with compassion. Maybe you can navigate playing with pleasure in a way that will be more effective, feel more comfortable, feel more safe. When you realize that you don't want to interact with pleasure because of X, then you know that you can provide yourself Y in order for it to be a positive experience. So let's just go right into the list. I've got about 9 items here. This is not an exhaustive list. The first one, and I'm putting this first because I want everyone to know this. Pleasure is embodied. We talked about this in episode 1 for this month. When you are experiencing pleasure, you are very connected to your body. It feels good. Pleasure is not an intellectual exercise. The reason why something feels pleasurable is because there is a very distinct feeling to it. You enter your body. If you grew up with a traumatic childhood, your body may also carry other sensations, very likely carries other sensations that are quite scary, that you want to avoid. Becoming connected with your body just right off the bat can feel very unsafe. So any practices that bring you closer to connecting with your body can feel dangerous. Pleasure's no exception. So the resistance to pleasure in this scenario is really just the resistance to body, which is so understandable. And there are many practices we can do to make interacting with our bodies safer. And we discuss those in other episodes. The next one, associating pleasure with obligation. This is, you get dessert after you eat your dinner, right? Which, okay, it's a very logical thing to say. But how often is it more than that? I'll take that vacation after this big project is done. I'll eat my lunch after I finish this. I'll go get myself a coffee when I've completed that. It's treated as a reward. There's always something I got to do before I get pleasure, which can be, well, I don't want to do more work. It's easier to just be collapsed than to fight through this obligation to get pleasure. When we view pleasure as exclusively a reward, it's not as interesting. An identity crisis. I see this a lot in my clients and in myself. A lot of times when we grew up in an environment that was really dangerous, there can be many of us that hold on to the identity of someone who never got to experience joy and pleasure. There's a piece of us, a very strong part of us, that needs the world to know our pain. This part of us is not wrong. I want to name that crystal clear. The part of us that says, I'm not allowed to feel pleasure because the moment I feel pleasure is the moment I'm discounting the pain that I went through. That's a part that needs a lot of love and compassion. And that's a part that resists pleasure. Gender and social conditioning. We have this on both sides, for men, for women, and for marginalized groups. Women are often taught that other people's needs are more important than theirs. That pleasure is actually selfishness. That a good woman goes out and takes care of others. She comes last. Pleasure is selfish for a woman. And men are conditioned for productivity. That pleasure is not a part of productivity. and that pleasure is actually soft, and men cannot be soft. So men have a different lens that makes pleasure difficult to access. A man should be out, going, getting, attaining, not receiving, in both sides, for women and for men. And many other marginalized groups are suppressed in their pleasure because the things that bring them pleasure may not fit in to societal norms. And if you're listening, I put norms in air quotes. So there can be a lot of structural reasons for pleasure being inaccessible to you. As children, there is also a lot of shame connected to pleasure. When you hear a child running around and screaming, a lot of times that kid is seen as being too much. We are mammals living in man-made societies. And the mammal part of us, the animal part of us, knows that pleasure is necessary and expresses it wildly, animal-like. And when you take that animal pleasure and you put it in a classroom with 25 other children, it's too much. And shame is about there's something wrong with me. So when your pleasure is too much, once again, air quotes, then there's something wrong with you. And that's where we see a coupling of pleasure and shame, which can make it very challenging to access as an adult. Another reason that goes into nervous system work is the fact that when you grew up under threat, you were really used to the survival parts of you running the show, driving the bus. Once again, please refer to episode 1. Your survival energy is what kept you safe. You were consistently either bracing for impact, running away from threat, directly fighting, interacting with it, or shutting down to try and save yourself in that moment. And pleasure is coming out of that survival energy, out of that shutdown. But if your nervous system is like a guard watch, waiting for the threat to come, it doesn't want to let its guard down. It doesn't want to stop bracing because, oh my God, what if? So pleasure can feel very threatening in that situation. Puritanical culture. This goes without saying. Depending on your religious upbringing, you may have a very negative connotation of pleasure. It's very directly linked with the sins of gluttony and lust. Pleasure has almost been inextricably connected with sexual expression in puritanical culture. It is seen as a vice. And whether you are religious or not, pleasure is a built-in mechanism of our nervous system. It is not a moral experience. It doesn't have to be mixed in with these religious concepts when we're talking about it as a healing practice. And then finally, hustle culture. Our culture is built on productivity. Capitalist culture says you work and you receive. You work and you receive. Your worth is built on how much you produce. Pleasure isn't a part of that mix. How can we take time away from productivity for pleasure when productivity is directly connected to our worth? It just doesn't happen. So it's a real reframe for people to see pleasure as something necessary. These are just a few of the many reasons why pleasure can be challenging for us to access. And each one of these things requires its own unique intervention to make pleasure accessible. Let's just go through a few examples. First, pleasure is embodied. So if this is why you're struggling with pleasure, if when I say that it resonates with you, I don't like to be in my body. So I don't want to access pleasure. Pleasure is scary for me in this situation. Then the intervention to make pleasure safe would be, how can I cultivate a relationship to my body that's safe? And there are a myriad of practices out there that you can use for that. I speak about many of them on this podcast. But that's where you start. And then pleasure can become safe. How about pleasure is associated with obligation? I don't get pleasure unless I work for it. Well, the intervention can be, how can I play with bringing pleasure into my life with no strings attached? What if I can couple those with one another? Can I let myself experience pleasure in small doses without asking anything of myself? What if you're always bracing and you live with an abundance of survival energy, or you're consistently shut down and pleasure, reaching into that connection, feels very unsafe for you? Okay, great. Now that we know this, what can we do to find safety before trying to find pleasure? We can look around, we can find resources, we can connect with things that help us feel grounded and safe. We find the practices that work for us to move that survival energy. We might be a shaker, we might be a yoga person, we might go on walks with our friends. What can we do to build safety? Then introduce pleasure. And the nervous system over time can see that pleasure can be here with safety. You can see why understanding why pleasure feels challenging for you can be powerful in your ability to access it. It's not about, well, now I know why I can't have pleasure. Guess that sucks for me. It's, okay, this is why this is inaccessible. Now what do I need? That gives me clues. It's information. Now what do I need? So after hearing all of this, I would encourage you to take a moment and either grab a pen and a paper or get your voice note out or talk to someone you feel safe talking to about this and see if you can just word dump how you feel about pleasure. The last time you felt pleasure, how often you feel like it's allowed in your life, any experiences that you feel are relevant for why it could be challenging for you to access, and just see what arises for you. Next week, we're diving into what pleasure really looks like and how we can differentiate pleasure from positive stimulation. They are two different things. So don't miss it. I'll see you there. Thanks for listening. To get the most from this podcast episode, visit alwaysvibin.com to join the free start program, or search Vibin Wellness in your Apple or Google Play App Store. The information in this episode is not intended to diagnose or treat any condition. Please contact your mental health practitioner or a medical doctor for advice specific to your needs.